After working with thousands of women, femmes, and thems as a life coach, I can tell you that it is really clear to me that the number one issue that keeps people stuck is black and white thinking. This is that tendency to see things as this or that. And it's also called dichotomous or polarized thinking. This line of thought is the most clear signal that you are experiencing what people call a limiting belief, or what psychologists call a cognitive distortion. It's a flawed thought pattern. So learning to recognize this black and white thinking as it's happening is key to moving beyond these limiting beliefs and stop feeling stuck. So let's examine what it is and how to stop it. First of all, let's be very clear that black and white thinking has nothing to do with color or race. It is the most common term people use to explain dichotomous thinking, so I'm using the language that I expect people will already be familiar with. That said, I am thrilled that the mental health profession is discussing the problematic issues with the term black and white thinking, and I echo those concerns. And that's why I'm going to try to switch to using extreme or polarized thinking for the rest of this. Polarized thinking is that tendency to rigidly assess anything as being good or bad, right or wrong, helpful or harmful. It's the type of thinking that tricks us into believing that our only options are to be successful or a failure, to be loved or to be hated, to have it all figured out or to be completely lost. That all or nothing mindset doesn't make room for a middle ground. It keeps us from seeing the world as being nuanced and full of shades of gray. So some words that can be flags for this type of polarized thinking include always, never, impossible, perfect, worst, best, should. Most people experience black and white thinking from time to time, but for some people, it can become the regular, normal way of thinking and seeing the world. The more often you experience these either-or types of thoughts, the more likely you are to judge yourself and others, and to quit things like projects or relationships when it gets difficult. So what causes this type of extreme thinking? It can be a signal of a serious mental health issue like bipolar disorder, narcissism, obsessive compulsive disorder, or depression. But for most people, this type of extreme thinking is a learned behavior, and it can be one that we develop in response to trauma. Some experts think that this type of thinking has its roots in the human survival instinct. That's because the more simplified our thinking, the more quickly we can respond when there's a threat. Boiling things down to just two options, this or that, makes it much easier for the brain to quickly react and go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And I want to add that I also believe this type of thinking is a direct result of living in white patriarchy. This type of binary thought is a patriarchal tool that establishes clear rules about what is good and bad, meaning male is better than female, white is better than black, rich is better than poor. All of the things that are part of white supremacist patriarchy. Living in patriarchy, like we all do, normalizes hierarchical right or wrong thinking. So it's really not surprising then that most of us are conditioned to apply this type of black and white thinking to all areas of our lives. Let me give you a few examples of this extreme thinking, polarized thoughts in action in case you're still not quite sure what I'm referencing. At its most extreme, this type of thinking is really obvious. It's something like, I will never find a relationship. I will always be poor. Reaching that goal is impossible. It can also be more sneaky and subtle, and we don't always recognize it within ourselves where other people might be able to notice it. It can look like absolute thoughts, like, I'm not qualified for that job. It can even show up as a question. What if I do it and I'm a total failure? It may be sounding like curiosity, or it may sound like it's a truth, but when we examine the facts, we can see, usually, that there is actually gray and nuance in all of the scenarios that our brain isn't considering. It is giving us only succeed or fail. And that brings me to a really good point, which is something that comes up a lot with clients as they begin to do this type of work of examining these thoughts. They will often say, how do I know if it is certainty, as in I know it to be true, versus the voice telling me it's either this or that with certainty? As in that example I gave that I'm not qualified for this job. It seems like certainty. And it is not always easy to tell the difference between your inner knowing and your intuition and this type of extreme, certain, this or that thinking. Both of them can feel really true. And there's not an easy answer for making this distinction, but it does become easier as you develop your understanding of polarized thinking and get more comfortable with your intuition. In general, the process of making a decision based on this type of polarized thinking is going to feel certain, absolute. The same process, when guided by intuition, will feel open and curious about possibilities. And after you've made the decision, if it comes from this extreme type of thinking, it will often feel heavy and restrictive and may lead to regret. Whereas a decision made from intuition or inner knowing is more likely to feel lighter, expansive, and may lead to a sense of relief. It doesn't always mean the decision is easy, but usually it feels expansive. Pay attention to those warning signs, and with time, you will begin to notice the difference and be really comfortable in knowing the difference between your inner knowing or intuition and this type of extreme thinking. So how do we change our thinking if we notice that we are engaging in this sort of black and white or this or that extreme thinking? Next week, I'm going to come back and talk to you about what to do when you recognize this type of polarized thinking in your own life. How do you begin to shift out of that and see the gray? What are the tools that you can use to stop extreme thinking in its tracks and find a way to show up with more expansive thoughts? I will be back next week, so make sure you tune in for that.